Movie presentation by Janora Jenkins. Multicultural Issues, Psych 3385, University of Incarnate Word. Today's presentation is based on a movie students were to choose from and discuss topics covered in the class that were presented in the movie. We're going to cover the following major topics: multicultural issues, the culturally competent therapist, interracial bias, followed by a conclusion and references. The movie I selected is American History X, produced by James Morrissey and directed by Tony Kaye. It was distributed by New Line Cinema in 1998. I watched this movie when it first came out, and I've always been a fan of it. The movie's premise about a skinhead named Derek, who has just been released from prison. He is trying to make amends for the damage he did before prison, and is trying to prevent his brother Daniel from going on the same path. The movie is very graphic and tackles issues on racism that are quite common in our society. It also covers topics that were discussed during our weekly reading in class. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss issues presented in the movie that were covered. It took me some time to consolidate all the themes covered, and after some careful deliberation, I came up with the following themes: multicultural issues in the workplace, the culturally competent therapist, and interracial bias. Each topic covered refers to a scene or scenes covered in the movie. I will use the research I have collected to support those themes. My intent is to give the viewer a real-life representation of what was discussed and covered during class. The movie is a work of fiction, but scenes in the movie are analogous to everyday life. The first thing we're going to cover is multicultural issues in the workplace and in education. The best place to start is the opening sequence with Mr. Sweeney and Daniel, represented in the picture in front of you. Mr. Sweeney plays the principal of the school Daniel attends, and Daniel is in the office for writing a book report on Mein Kampf. For those of you who don't know, Mein Kampf is a manifesto written by Adolf Hitler after World War I, where he describes his plans for Germany and the future race. Daniel's teacher found this behavior unacceptable and very offensive. Daniel's teacher is Jewish. This here is a multicultural issue in the workplace and education. Daniel's teacher wants to expel Daniel from school and thinks Daniel is incorrigible. Mr. Sweeney told the teacher he's wrong for harboring biases and that Daniel's family history should be considered. I view this as a workplace-related multicultural issue. Mr. Sweeney is a black man serving as the principal, dealing with a student who expresses implicit racism with explicit intent. Daniel's teacher is a Jewish man that does have a family history with Daniel's family. Mr. Sweeney was able to defuse the situation and provide a chance for Daniel to redeem himself by giving him another assignment, which will be discussed later. The reason Mr. Sweeney was able to handle this situation is due to him displaying multicultural competence. Research conducted by Trobo Mason in 2013 showed that the workplace needs organizational leadership that displays multicultural competence. Research conducted by Pask and others in 2013 found that the importance that school faculty members would need to have and be aware of prejudices of discriminatory behavior. Trouble Mason's work provided support for the use of a theoretically based long-term diversity training program to facilitate positive change in attitudes toward dissimilar people. In the case of the movie, Mr. Sweeney is the organizational leader of the school as the principal, and he was able to understand the bias and discriminatory behavior of each person involved to include himself, and he was able to point out the wrongs of all parties, and he then developed a plan to fix it. Next, we're going to look at the culturally competent therapist. Mr. Sweeney is the closest this movie has to a culturally competent therapist, but the role he plays is a pivotal one. Mr. Sweeney is not only the principal of the school, but he works with the police department gangs unit. The movie implies that his specialty is helping troubled youth turn their lives around, and I found it interesting that he's a black man that dedicates his time to help Daniel and Derek. Daniel was a good kid who became a skinhead in the movie, and Daniel is along the same path. There are three things that make Mr. Sweeney a culturally competent therapist, besides the fact he's a black man that's trying to get two skinheads to turn their life around. First, he was able to establish a perceived trustworthiness with Derek. The movie alludes that Mr. Sweeney had a relationship with Derek for quite some time. He was Derek's teacher before he ever became a principal, and he knew Derek after he graduated high school, and he had a relationship with Derek in prison. At the time Derek is paroled, he shows trust in Mr. Sweeney and follows his advice to join the skinheads as an informant. This could be due to the length of time Derek and Mr. Sweeney have known each other. Research conducted by Levin, Whitener, and Cross in 2006 proved perceived trustworthiness can be established through time with the exchange of different types of information. Mr. Sweeney never gave up on Derek and continued to share information with him that helped to establish perceived trustworthiness. The movie also shows a graphic sexual assault on Derek that happened after he disassociated with the skinheads in prison. The first and only person to check on him was Mr. Sweeney. During that time, Mr. Sweeney provided comfort and advice to Derek, and he self-disclosed to Derek what he learned from belonging to gangs and being in prison. The scene marks the beginning of Derek's transition to a better person who is not consumed by hate. Derek's turnaround could have something to do with Mr. Sweeney's self-disclosure. The main reason is because this is the first time Derek really listened to what Mr. Sweeney had to say and followed his advice. This coincides with Derek going on a better path. Research conducted by Henretti and others in 2014 showed that self-disclosure made by a therapist can improve the outcome of the patient. Self-disclosure helps to bridge the gap between the client and the therapist by showing the client similarities he or she may have with the therapist. Mr. Sweeney also demonstrates self-perceived cultural competence. The interaction Mr. Sweeney had with Daniel's teacher showed Mr. Sweeney knew about Derek Daniels and that teacher's history. He was confident that he was able to turn Daniel's life around. He was also a subject matter expert for the police on a local skinhead activity and was sought after by the police as a gang expert. Research conducted by Tumala Nar and others in 2012 stated a self-perceived culturally competent therapist must be able to be experienced in race and culture. This movie implies the area of California everything took place in was a majority black city, with whites being the minorities. This is one of the reasons I think Mr. Sweeney displayed self-perceived cultural competence. He's dealing with skinheads that view him as the enemy. He knows the reasons they feel that way. He knows what resources are available to help troubled youths to get off the street. And I don't think he could have been successful if he did not perceive himself as culturally competent. Interracial bias is seen throughout this movie. The picture you see in front of you is a form of micro-invalidation, which is defined by Sue and others in 2007 as communication that negates or nullifies the psychological thoughts or feelings of people of color. Blowing smoke in somebody's face shows that you don't regard the other person as equal to you. Daniel was blowing smoke directly in his kid's face. The perception of his actions shows that Daniel doesn't care about the feelings of the black kid, and he makes it known by blowing the smoke in his face. The black kid feels completely disrespected and offended by Daniel's actions. This is the motive for the black kid shooting Daniel to death at the end of the movie. A basketball game that showed the skinheads versus the blacks was a great example of micro assaults. The teams played without regard for one another. The whole reason they was playing to have supremacy of the basketball court. Throughout the game, there was a constant use of racial epithets like niggers, coons, and crackers, which is a great example. Sue and others define microassaults as using explicit racial derogation by a verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt. I can't think another reason why the words I just mentioned was used outside of trying to hurt somebody. This picture here is a scene of an interview Derek gave after the death of his father. The opinions he gave about his father's murder in the interview was characteristic of what Smith, L., etc. called the spinning of racism. Derek felt his father was a victim by blacks who had nothing to do but sell drugs all day, and they were not deserving of his dad's help. At this point in time, Derek didn't consider himself as a racist, but he spun the narrative in the interview that the blacks who murdered his son, his dad, had no reason to do so. This scene here shows Derek giving a motivational speech before a grocery store raid. He displays in the speech a hatred towards minorities because he feels that whites are the ones who are really being discriminated against. Immigrant workers were taking all of the good jobs. Tax dollars were being spent on people who were not meant to be in this country legally. He states the owner of the grocery store is discriminating against whites and responsible why Derek and his friends can't get jobs because that guy only hires minorities. And that owner is also the reason that grocery store closed down. This speech was is what motivates the group to wreak havoc in the grocery store. Research conducted by Rogers and Prentice Dunn in 1980 showed that when groups are emotionally aroused, they will revert to their traditional racist beliefs known as regressive racism. Derek motivated the others by providing the facts that explain their anger, which aroused their emotions. The results of his speech were the dismantling of the grocery store. This movie shows Daniel becoming increasingly violent. This scene right here is what actually had Derek, not Daniel, locked up in jail for the murder of two black men who were trying to steal his car. In my opinion, Derek felt that non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, especially blacks, posed an imminent threat to his skinhead way of life. Again, this movie is taking place in California that is populated by a black majority population. Blacks had killed his father, and they were now trying to steal his car. At this point in time, Derek felt that there was an existential threat on his way of life. Research conducted by Jonas and Fritsch in 2013 showed that when people perceive a threat to their existence, they will typically support the worldviews of their in-group, in Derek's case, skinheads, and possibly escalate their hostility. And that's exactly what Derek did, as you can see here in this photo. The last picture is a quote by Daniel that shows how he changed learning about his brother and his views on racism. The project Mr. Sweeney gave him was to write a report on Daniel's brother Derek to see what he learned. And what Derek learned was that it was no good to hate. Mr. Sweeney gave him this project knowing what Derek had been through and how he felt about skinheads. This would seem like a an inventive way of Mr. Sweeney getting Daniel to unlearn his bias. And Daniel learned that nothing positive was going to come out of racism and hate. Rubin and others stated diversity training is a way to get people to unlearn their biases. This is what Mr. Sweeney did to Daniel, in my opinion. It was just unfortunate that this transition happened too late. In the movie, he was gunned down moments after quoting the phrase in the picture. There are several things that can be learned from what was discussed here today. There are many tools available for therapists to be effective when dealing with multicultural issues, like being culturally competent, and that racism exists in many forms around us every day, whether it is explicitly or implicitly displayed. This movie also serves as a good example of the cycle of hate. And the first step in breaking the cycle of hate and racism is an increased understanding of different people and different cultures. This presentation was not all inclusive and merely serves as an example of multicultural issues in everyday life It also stimulates discussion on the implications of therapists and how to handle clients with these types of experiences.